right. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. It's the top of the hour. My name is Kelly Crane and I'm with NTAC, and it is my pleasure to introduce today's session. We have Dr. Marcia Ellison, who is a professor of psychiatry at the UMass Chan Medical Center in the great state of Massachusetts. And today, Marcia will be sharing with us strategies to improve post-secondary outcomes of youth with mental health needs through transition planning and career and technical education. And just want to remind folks to put on your mute, turn off your cameras, and certainly use the chat box for any questions you might have. And we'll have an opportunity at the end to ask Dr. Ellison some questions. So Marcia, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. You can all hear me, right? Yes, we're doing okay. Okay, the next slide, Raj. So I want to first acknowledge the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, who provided funding for the test guides that I'll be describing later, as well as this webinar. So we really appreciate that. I want to also acknowledge our partners, Deanne Unruh and Catherine Fowler from NTAC, who participated in the test project in very meaningful ways. So we thank them very much. I am presenting as a faculty member of the Transitions to Adulthood Center for Research. Our mission is up there on the slide. We do focus on youth and young adults with serious mental health conditions. Please come visit our website. You will get tons of resources that will help you with your transition planning and other aspects of helping youth with mental health conditions to get and keep jobs and higher education. So that's that for my commercial, and we could go to the next slide. Briefly today, we're going to talk about the post-secondary outcomes of students with emotional disturbance. We will talk about research-based effective transition practices, including career and technical education, which is the acronym is CTE that I'll be using, and then describe some strategies to mitigate barriers that these students face. Okay, next slide. So we begin at the beginning. Why is completed education important for students with disabilities? Broadly speaking, but for students with emotional disturbance as well. So here's a chart from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Pretty straightforward. You can look on the blue side, and this is earnings as you go up with higher education degrees. The dotted worker being the dotted line being the median income for across the US, for adults across the US. Yes, thank you. It's always shocking to see these graphics. Yes, indeed. It's also sort of shocking and surprising that even an associate's degree doesn't quite get you over the line of median income, but is still way better than what you get with a high school diploma or no diploma. And on the green side is the obverse, is what happens with unemployment rates. As education goes up, the vulnerability to recessions goes down. So education is important. Next slide. What about employment? Obviously, higher education leads to better employment. We just saw that. Why is employment so important for youth with mental health conditions? So first of all, it's important to know that 24% of all young adults who receive SSI, supplemental security income, had mental health conditions. I mean, obviously, that's a whopping percentage of all youth who receive SSI. Just as a reminder, the monthly SSI rate is $794, which for an individual, believe it or not, is below the federal poverty level. So you put the two together, 24% of young adults on SSI are living below the federal poverty level. Just to make that clear, only 5% of them are employed, have some additional income that is coming into their SSI, only 5%. The very really sort of concerning statistic is that once on, youth with emotional disturbance, once they get on the rolls before the age of 18, they remain on the disability rolls for an average of 27 years. And conversely is that the rates of exit from SSI rolls are lowest among adults with serious mental health conditions. So if you're thinking that SSI or disability benefits is the way to go for a youth with mental health condition, this is our way of saying is it's not enough. And we really do need to try to get employment and higher education for these youth. Okay, next slide. Okay, so briefly, who are we talking about? Students with mental health conditions or emotional disturbance, emotionally based characteristics. It's of significant duration, frequency, and intensity. These are students who often violate school and social norms. They don't get along with peers, often have traumatic backgrounds that are interfering with their education performance. And also, very importantly, they often don't have role models as workers. This may be different from students with other disabilities who do have families where, you know, one or both parents are working. A lot of these youth are coming from child welfare or foster care, and or from many generations of family poverty where they don't have a role model of as a worker. Also, these students, like students with disabilities more generally, they have difficulties with executive functioning skills. So sustaining concentration, screening out stimuli, time and task management. And from the emotional point of view, it lacking in interpersonal skills. They may have impulse and behavioral difficulties and difficulties with emotional regulation. So these are the kind of challenges that you as educators and employment specialists are facing when you're trying to better the lives of these students. Okay, next slide. When you put all of that together, what do you see for outcomes for these youth? They do live below the poverty level, low rates of employment, higher rates of substance abuse, and a whopping 35% failed to complete high school. That is attributable to their mental health conditions. They have higher rates of arrest, low success rates in vocational rehabilitation, housing instability. Okay, it's the gamut of social ills that you can that you see and can imagine. Next slide. How about their special education outcomes? So the data I'm about to present all comes from the National Longitudinal Transition Survey. This was done some years ago by SCI International. And this was a representative survey of youth in special education, and it followed them for up to 5 or 7 years. So what we found is that we looked at students with emotional disturbance in particular, from all students with disabilities in special education. And they had the worst attendance, poorest grades, and poorest grade progression compared to other disability groups. Again, here's your high school dropout rates of 35%. 1/3 of those that did graduate did not receive a regular diploma, rather had a certificate of completion. And 42% had never had a competitive job in 3 years post-high school. Next slide. Now, moving from their high school outcomes to their post-secondary education outcomes. Some of them do make it to college and to four-year colleges, but here is a dropout rate of up to 86%. Low graduation rates, less than half obtain a certificate or degree when they are enrolled, and also less than 20% obtain any accommodations or supports. That's part of the unique circumstance of these youth and students who do not see themselves as having a disability, don't understand that accommodations can be afforded to them because of their mental health challenges. And also have often the intellectual capacity to do well at school. In fact, we saw post-secondary outcomes where it's not the grades that are impacting these youth, rather it is their dropout rates. They simply can't manage the post-secondary demands and they drop out. Next slide. This is going back again to the NLTS survey. If you look at what happens to these youth with emotional disturbances by the time out of high school. So in the first 2 years, there's nearly 41% were not working and were not in school. It does improve these rates as it goes forward in years, and we tend to find more of these youth are either working or they are enrolled in school part-time. So the statistic gets better, but for the first 2 years, these students are leaving high school and not doing anything. Next slide. Here is just a little bit more data about post-secondary school enrollment, how many of them are going on to college. And this is the light blue are young adults in the general population. The dark blue are young adults with emotional disturbance. And first of all, there is, of course, a large gap for enrollment in any post-secondary school. It's a little closer for two-year colleges, and it's a little bit bigger for four-year colleges. But what very interesting for me and relevant to the rest of the presentation is that for career or technical education, we actually see more young adults with emotional disturbance in CTE versus young adults in the general population. Okay, next slide. So armed with these data from the NLTS survey, we received funding, federal funding, to develop guides that will help transition planners to effect better changes through transition planning for these students. So next slide. Based on the data, there were 3 practices that stood out and were predictive of better post-secondary outcomes for students with emotional disturbance. And these 3 are student-led individualized education program meetings, a concentration of career and technical education, and community partnerships and transition planning. So we developed a guide for each one of these findings, which I'll describe briefly here. Next slide. So in terms of students taking a leadership role during their transition planning meeting, we found there were 4 times more likely to enroll in college, in a 2- or 4-year college, if they had that leadership role. And this was compared to similar students with emotional disturbance in special education who did not take a leadership role. So if you, just the point of understanding how this research was conducted. And then secondarily, when a post-secondary school representative, a community college representative came to the transition planning meeting, you had, again, a very large impact on the likelihood of these students to actually enroll in community college. 28% higher rate of likelihood of enrolling. Next slide. And then we examined the effects of taking career and technical education on full-time employment. So here we find that if a youth with emotional disturbance took any general education CTE, there was a slightly larger likelihood of them having full-time employment. However, if they took a concentration of CTE, and by that we mean 4 or more CTE credits in an occupationally specific subject, they were 4 times more likely to have full-time employment after high school. And then if you look at the bottom bar on this chart, they were any general education CTE course was still significantly more likely to have employment anytime since, if you're just looking at any time since leaving high school. And if you look at a concentration of CTE coursework, again, it was 4 times more likely to have full-time employment. So just think about this in juxtaposition to the earlier data I showed, where 40% after high school were doing nothing. Here we find that when students took a concentration of CTE credits, they were employed, they were full-time employed in those 2 years after high school. So that really motivated us to try to do something to get these findings into practice among special educators. Next slide. So we had these objectives in mind as we developed the test guides. We want to, of course, support teacher capacity for transition planning and make these resources available to them. We understood that when community partners are involved in transition planning, we can predict better post-secondary outcomes. We're hoping to involve more students in CTE coursework and generally increase their engagement in post-secondary education, training, or employment. Next slide. So the result is these 3 guides for transition planning, and I'm going to talk about each of them briefly. I have a URL down here below. All of these guides are available on our website at the Transitions to Adulthood Center for Research. There is a website special for the test guides. You can download them all for free, as many as you like. You can contact us and we'll be happy to send you hard copies of the guides as well. Next slide. I saw your request to put it in the chat, and we'll try to do that before the end of this session. Okay, so let's start with the first one, student-led IEPs. What the guide does is go through these 5 main steps. First of all, helping the youth with mental health condition understand what is the IEP, why is it important, how can they use it to better their high school experience and prepare them for post-secondary employment. On the right side is a tip sheet that we created. These are for students in particular. We wrote it to them, again, with the help of Catherine Fowler and Deanne Unruh. And it educates students, what is an IEP, who is it for, why is it important, and to help. The kinds of feedback that we got from students was, this is like a joke, this doesn't have any meaning to me, I sleep through these meetings. Rather, we want to help prepare students to actually take a leadership role and make it a meaningful experience for them. So we in the guide, we help special educators to build self-determination among these students, create goals for your IEP, help them to actually lead and practice leading their IEP meeting. Next slide. Then the second of the three guides is our community partnerships practice guide. I think many of you know already that interagency collaboration and participation of other agencies as you conduct transition planning for students is critical, and is so much so also for students with mental health conditions. And as what this guide helps you to do is to think about the myriad of adult agencies that are really relevant and necessary for these students to move on to employment or post-secondary education. So foremost among those is vocational rehabilitation. Get VR involved if they aren't already. Get your child and adult mental health agencies involved if they aren't already. And all of those agencies will be very important, including housing, income supports, and the like. So this guide will help you to think about who are all these people in your local area. How should you reach out to them? How do you talk about what transition planning is and who this youth is, and how do you get them to actually come and participate in the IEP and participate in thinking about how they should be engaged with this young person as they graduate high school. On the right, again, is a tip sheet that we created for youth. So if you're serving youth with mental health conditions, as many of you are, please download this tip sheet. I've got my crew, and it's the same. It's helping the youth to think about who should come to my meeting, who should help me think about what my life should be like post-high school, and who can support me. Next. Just to underscore why this is important for these particular students is that after high school, many fall off the grid. There is usually, in most states, a gap between child mental health and adult mental health. They may be in child mental health while they're in high school, and then when they turn 18 or 21, they literally are no longer eligible. We've heard horror stories of foster care youth who are, or child welfare youth who are come to the end of their eligibility for child welfare services and are literally left on street corners with suitcases. So that's the importance of mind the gap and try to build these supports as they're going to move out of high school and into adult life. Next slide. Okay, so last but not least is career and technical education, which I'm going to focus on for the remainder of this talk. And I'm going to introduce this guide by a little video that we prepared. And we could go on to the next slide. And you, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not quite ready there for the video. Just go to the next slide and you'll get to the video shortly. Okay, next slide. If you don't know what is in career and technical education, it is integrated academic and vocational courses. It often involves community-based, work-based learning experiences. And CTE should link to post-secondary education or employment. Very much so, CTE gives an opportunity to earn certificates in specific career areas. And CTE tends to partner with local businesses and should and are mandated to do that so that youth with disabilities and youth with mental health conditions actually have a way to move into employment in their area. Next slide. One of the important provisions of CTE is that career and technical education through Perkins 5 mandates. So that's new legislation about career and technical education. And each state has to submit a Perkins 5 plan for their career and technical education, and they need to demonstrate how the CTE education in their area is linked to in-demand industries. So they need to do an assessment of what are the industries in my state, in my area, that will have substantial current or potential impact for the local economy, so that you can begin to prepare students for positions where there are jobs to get. So that's a very valuable feature of CTE. Next slide. So how is CTE organized? I think we have to sort of click through to get these other boxes filled in. Raj, is that working? But I will say that first of all, CTE is organized by having a national career clusters framework. So there are 16 career clusters that have been defined federally that apply to different high demand industries. And across the 16 career clusters are 79 career pathways. And this is literally ways in which an individual can get the education and experience to move along a career pathway that lands themselves employable in demand industry. So the career clusters framework provides a structure for organizing and delivering quality CTE programs. So it helps learners to identify their interests. It bridges programs of study with plans for careers. And it also describes the training and credentials that are needed for a variety of jobs. Okay, next slide. So these are the career clusters. They'll look familiar to you. So if you are interested in learning about the career clusters, we have a website down here from careertech.org, and you can learn more about career clusters. Next slide. I'm giving you here an example of the transportation, distribution, and logistics career cluster. So if you go to, in this case, Career One Stop, it will describe to you what is involved in a career cluster, what do individuals do, and also what is the future expectation for employment in that career cluster. And this is all for the purpose of helping students to think about a post-secondary goal. Where do they want to go? What seems to fit with them and their strengths, and helps to define the career pathway. Next slide. This is a little bit more detail from the Minnesota Department of Education. And again, it describes the career clusters, these career fields, and all the different kinds of positions and career pathways that there are to get a position within these career fields. Next slide. So let's just to demonstrate to you how this would work. So this career cluster is maintenance, installation, and repair. It also has some related occupations. And then you can see if you have a high school diploma, starting at the bottom, you might be able to get employment as a fabric mender. However, with less than 1 year of education in career technical education, it moves up. You can get positions as a locksmith, outdoor power equipment mechanic, maintenance and repair workers. 1 to 3 years of CTE will again move you up into positions such as industrial machinery mechanic, sheet metal worker. With a bachelor's degree, you have the opportunity to become an electrical engineer and so forth. So if you go onto these websites, you can see these different career pathways within these clusters and use that as a way of working with the youth that you're working with to think about what's possible for me. What do I need to do to get there? Okay, next slide. So that's CTE more broadly, but there is a good bit of research about CTE in students with disabilities. Again, cross-disability, it is an evidence-based predictor of post-school employment. And we get that from intact research, previous research. Again, a concentration of secondary high school career technical education is predictive of positive outcomes for all students with disabilities, including those with serious mental health conditions. They were more likely to be gainfully employed when students have CTE, and more likely to obtain and keep their paid competitive jobs. Okay, next slide. Well, that all sounds good, but can I get CTE in my district? Well, 98% of public high school districts offer CTE programs. In fact, 9 million secondary students have participated in CTE, and almost 1 million of those 9 million had a disability status. So yes, CTE is out there, and students with disabilities are accessing CTE and enjoying some of the positive outcomes that come with that. Okay, next slide. What about encouraging CTE for students with emotional disturbance? As you saw, these students have some of the worst outcomes. Does CTE work for them? First of all, we do have this tip sheet here. This is oriented for youth, schools that make sense, and helps them to think about CTE and how it can be helpful for them. Next slide. So now we're going to show you a video that we made for the TEST CTE guide. So please stay tuned. This is available on YouTube. You can certainly show this to and share this link with folks in your district that may be interested. TEST CTE is a guide for special educators who are conducting the transition component of a student's individualized education plan. We prepared this guide because research has shown that for students with emotional disturbances, 4 credits of career and technical education in high school that is aligned to a particular career does lead to 4 times better employment outcomes than does the same group of students who do not have those credits of CTE. What's special about the TEST CTE guide is that it offers considerations and practical tips about how to work with students who have emotional disturbances.
For students with disabilities, their outcomes across all measures after high school are generally not as positive as for students without disabilities or young adults without disabilities, both in employment and enrolling in college or other post-secondary learning.
It has been demonstrated that participation in career and technical education can increase their graduation rates, but also their employment rates specific to that disability type.
I feel like in high school, most of the professors, they focus on getting good grades and going to college, but college is not for everyone, especially for people who have like disadvantages. If had I gotten like a technical certification or something like that, it would have been much easier.
For youth that have emotional disturbance or who are experiencing mental health challenges, they provide a relevant setting that may maintain their engagement in school, as opposed to some of the academic settings that they may not be experiencing as much success in.
I think trade schools, they're very helpful, and especially for somebody that has anxiety, it's a lot more helpful than to be in a bigger classroom and to be around all those different people and feel all that pressure, because you're getting to do exactly what you need to do and you're not taking the prerequisites.
This guide can provide is the support for teachers who are career and technical education teachers to work with their special educators and even reach out to their community for vocational rehabilitation to support holistic theories of experiences for youth with emotional disturbance.
It really provides a roadmap for just quality transition planning, but with an assumption that students are going to participate in CTE coursework and really embedding that into the plan, which is what we know is really good practice and effective practice. It does a nice job of helping tackle what can feel like sort of where do I begin?
TEST CTE provides resources and steps to take to help students plan a sequence of 4 credits of career and technical education during their high school years to achieve a post-secondary goal of employment in an in-demand and high-wage career.
Each of the pieces within the guide is important, so I would certainly encourage educators to explore the whole guide and really get that sense of what the assessment process is, doing that pre-planning. There's an implementation guide within the guide, and there's lots of resources. There's links to lots of resources and forms and tip sheets, and all of those things are critically important to tackling this really important aspect of transition planning.
You can always reach out to us at the Transitions to Adulthood Center for Research, where you can download the guide for free and also reach out to us personally for technical assistance. We'd be happy to help and provide guidance to you as you embark on this rewarding opportunity for students with emotional disturbances.
I get to do what I love, and I get to earn my own money, to buy my own things, support the economy. This program is helpful a lot for me, and it helps me to help people in my community and to encourage them to try to get into programs like this, because because of their mental illness, they don't think that they can learn. But I try to let people know that no matter what your disability is, you can do it.
All right. Thank you all for your patience with the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Those are the voices of real students who have taken CTE classes and have benefited from it. I'm going to go quickly through these next slides. The guide itself goes through these. This is the roadmap. Do assessments, conduct career exploration, formulate a SMART post-secondary goal, specify the progression of CTE classes, and then develop IEP supports to support that learning. We'll go through the next slide. We've detailed some of these steps. You'll find it in the guide. And then we'll go to the next slide, because this is probably what people are really thinking about, which is that all sounds great, but what about students with emotional disturbance? There are particular challenges of CTE with them. And one of them is that there is a real stigma of CTE classes. What we heard from youth is all we heard in high school was college prep. Nobody ever talked about being able to use my hands, address my attention deficit disorder by doing hands-on work. And so one of the first things you might want to do is address CTE, talk about how it is that how much money an electrician can make and compared to some other vocations that people come out with a bachelor's degree and don't make nearly as much money. View the career clusters and their pay rates, and also develop coursework for soft skills, and address the executive functioning, time and task management needs as part of their IEP. Next slide. What's really necessary is to work with the CTE instructors who may be reluctant to work with students with mental health conditions, or don't know how to work with them, or may have some real misunderstandings about what kinds of barriers these students have and what kind of accommodations can help. One of the most significant barriers are attendance policies, and students with mental health conditions may be out of school for some periods of time for hospitalization or other causes. So you need strategies to make up missed classroom hours, especially when those classroom hours are necessary for certification. Here are some strategies. Talk with the instructor about opening the lab at other times. Provide online coursework as a way to make up time, and see if there's a possibility of using measures of competency rather than time units. Strategies to reduce, we'll go on to the next slide. So very much so, accommodations are these youth are entitled to accommodations, but the typical list of accommodations may not be helpful. You need to think a little outside the box in terms of accommodations for students with emotional disturbance. We have a tip sheet here about what some of those outside the box accommodations can be. Things like no participation expectations. Don't grade on participating if the student is too anxious to raise their hand. Provide a safe space to relax if anxious, and breaks in class. Foremost, think about flexible attendance policies as an accommodation. Next slide. Other supports: build hope for a future and a vocational identity. Visit the class ahead of time. And then, as I said, work with the CTE instructor, establish a collaboration with them. You're both in it to win it with this student with behavioral challenges and emotional disturbance. Next slide. I do want to say that we have piloted Test CTE in states in Maine and Connecticut, and we are very grateful for the participation of them. And Missy, I know, is on this presentation, and the state leaders have been instrumental in helping us to pilot these guides. They were very successful, and we learned things in the course of doing the piloting, like this need to help educators with strategies to reduce anxiety. These are some basic things to do when you're working with a student who is too anxious to show up for class or to their CTE class. Next slide. I'm going to close with a pretty quick Test CTE success story. This was a young man who had an internship doing screen printing. The business closed, but there was an opportunity to go to a different business who was willing to pay them for their work. The work went well, and the business owner was impressed with the skills that the student developed, and the internship ended with an expectation that he would be employed in the screen printing shop. Next slide. These are some of the strategies that the educator mentioned to us. They used weekly check-ins, weekly quizzes on what they learned. They helped him to revise his resume and did mock interviews. And over time, the supports for this student were able to be phased out. Okay. Next slide. That's actually it for me. There's my email address. Please come visit our slide, or rather our website. And I know we're at the end, so Kelly, you can let me know if there's some time for questions, or let people go and I can handle questions independently.
Well, thank you, Marcia. There were a couple questions that came in. I believe most of them you answered, but if we could just take time for one question here. And the question is around, given the fact that many individuals with severe mental health illnesses don't have their first episode or major symptoms until their early 20s, how does this really impact their engagement in CTE?
Well, if first break is happening in their early 20s, a lot of these students have already graduated high school, and many of them are in college, and that's where first break happens. There's a lot of programming going on right now for first episode psychosis. But I have to say that the TEST CTE guide is not geared to those students. It is really geared to the students who have significant mental health challenges that appeared in childhood or in early adolescence. And they are already in middle school and high school with a well-known disability. They may or may not be in special education, but they do have a mental health challenge, and that's who we're trying to support. But I would say that if you are dealing with students who have a first break, post-high school, please check with your State Department of Mental Health because there is substantial programming going on for improving the education and employment of these students along with their mental health.
Thank you, Marcia. And I think that's all we have time for. Check out the chat. There are the resources that Marcia highlighted during her presentation. The links to those resources are in the chat box, and Matt just pulled together a nice little summary of all those for you. So go in there, grab those out. And I want to thank Dr. Ellison again. It was a very informative presentation. So
that was great. Thank you.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.